Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
When it comes to weight loss, no 2 people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't out-train her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Outdoor adventures often come with a side of itch. That's why you need Sarna Calm and Cool. Sarna Calm and Cool provides the soothing care your skin needs. Sarna Calm and Cool lotion relieves itch and pain from insect bites, sunburn, and poison ivy with 1% pramoxine hydrochloride and 0.5% menthol. Did you know Sarna is the #1 dermatologist-recommended topical anti-itch brand? Learn more at sarnalotion.com today.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to BattleWalks. I'm battlefield historian Matt McLachlan, and I am loving this podcast series. It's fantastic to be out walking across the great battlefields of Europe, and indeed, a few more far-flung places are on the horizon as well. So walking across the great battlefields of the world. I'm loving it. Thank you to everyone who's been contacting us. Thousands and thousands of new listeners have joined us in the last month or two, and it's just wonderful to hear that people are enjoying what we're doing. So please continue to send us comments, continue to send suggestions into us. A lot of people are listening to us on YouTube, which is quite interesting, so continue to send lots of good messages through there. Facebook, Twitter, we now have dedicated pages for BattleWalks on both Facebook and Twitter, so certainly track us down. Also, personally, me, Matt McLachlan, or my host, Pete Smith, or Living History. There's a whole heap of ways to get in touch with us, so please just do reach out and say hi. We love to hear from you. Joining me, as always, from France is Pete Smith. Pete, g'day.
Hi, Matt. Ready for another walk on the battlefields?
It's going to be a good one, this one, Matt. Mate, I always love getting out. We do some that are in cities. We do some that are on specific sites. But I love these ones where we get out and actually walk across a battlefield. And this is a good one. We did Bullecourt a few weeks ago, which was really great. I really enjoyed that one. And that's been one of our most popular downloads we've done to date. This is another one. Again, it'll resonate with our Australian listeners, but I'm sure our listeners from Britain and Canada and the US and France and everywhere else will also enjoy it because it's just such a fascinating walk. This is the Battle of Le Hamel, or the Battle of Hamel, as it was called during the First World War, in 1918. Not to be confused with the region also in the Somme of Beaumont-Hamel, where the famous Newfoundland Memorial Park is. This is Hamel near Villers-Bretonneux, right in the heart of the Australian battlefields. It's going to be a good walk.
It certainly is, and very right to comment upon the Le Hamel issue, because there are more than one. I think there are about 3 Hamels just in this area, in the Somme and Pas-de-Calais. So we always make sure that when we're talking about it, that we say Le Hamel, but the soldiers and the officers at the period that the fighting took place in 1918, they would have just known it as Hamel. But try and use Le Hamel, certainly if you're doing any research or you're trying to find it on the map.
There was even one when we did our D-Day podcast on Port and Bessin. There was also, I noticed as you were talking about their objectives as they came ashore, there was a Hamel there in the middle of all that as well. So it's a popular French name. It probably just means small village or something in French. It's a very common. It probably harks back to the same as the word ham in English, which just relates to a small village. There's probably a connection there. I'm no linguist, but I assume that there'd be a connection. But it is a very popular name, particularly in this part of France.
It is, yeah. So,
an interesting walk, this one. Where should we start? Because I do want to talk about John Monash, because this battle is considered his, it's been called his masterpiece. I mean, Peter Fitzsimons had his book, which came out a couple of years ago, called Monash's Masterpiece, 93 Minutes That Changed the World. And, we Australians are always up for a bit of hyperbole, but I thought that one was that was going all in. That was going all in on the importance of this battle. Let's start with the history. Let's do one of your excellent potted histories of why this thing occurred, and then let's just talk a little bit about Monash and its importance in the scheme of the First World War.
Okay, so the Battle of Le Hamel, what's it all about? Well, this is a period when we are drawing breath. We've just faced the German onslaught, the Grey Avalanche that started on the 21st of March, and the Germans have been pushing us back effectively up until almost this period. So let's get the date sorted out. The 4th of July. This is the battle that's going to take place on the 4th of July.
We should say at this point, this is 1918 we're talking about, so we're late in the war. We're back in the. I mentioned Somme at the top of the discussion, and that's true. We are back in the Somme, but not in 1916. We're now late in the war in 1918.
Yeah, so Grey Avalanche, the Germans forcing us back. We've basically stopped the Germans. We are drawing breath, and it's going to be our turn. We are preparing. We are going to now take the war back to the Germans and start to force them back. It's going to be known as the 100 Days, the Battle of Amiens, and it will start where we are, at Le Hamel. So, but we're not going to talk about that. That's for a future podcast, but that's where we are at this point, and there is a bulge in the line. There's a bulge in the line that needs to be sorted out, but there's something else going on. The French are under pressure again, and they are holding. They've been equally under pressure by the Germans, and they are also hoping to draw breath. And so what they want is they don't want any more Germans basically turning up in their sectors and putting even more pressure on them. So they're requesting if we can keep the Germans busy. In other words, if we can keep nudging against their lines. We call it at this period peaceful penetration. It actually comes from 1917. And this is where we are basically just taking lumps out the German lines. We're not giving them back. We are raiding and then holding the sections. So we're keeping the Germans under pressure. But we have this big bulge at Le Hamel that involves a little bit of a ridge. It's called the Wolfsberg, and it gives the Germans a good view, and we really need the Germans not to have that view, and we need to straighten the line. So this battle is all about straightening the line and taking out this bulge in the line in preparation for the big attack on the 8th of August.
You mentioned peaceful penetration, Pete, and we'll cover that in more detail in another podcast, but it's worth mentioning here that we, as Australians, we tend to claim that we invented it. That's not quite true. We were wonderful exponents of this technique of peaceful penetration, but it was something that was going all along the British and indeed the French lines as well. And the concept was that small units, as you said, would go out on effectively raids, but not give up the ground once they'd captured it. And part of the story that I loved was that one day the Aussies, later in 1918, were in a particular part of the line quite actively raiding, and an order came down from headquarters to say, we want the battalion to advance and take out this section of German trench. And the platoon commander was very happy to report back to headquarters that his platoon had already captured all of the ground stipulated in the order for the entire battalion to take. So, a handful of men, probably only, 30, 40, 50 men had captured an area of ground that was probably intended for 500 in those orders. So it was a fascinating period of the war, which doesn't get enough attention. This idea of these, I love this story of this part of 1918 when there's all this active raiding going on and pinching out little parts of the German line and taking lots of prisoners and just continually just nibbling away at the Germans and never letting them settle.
I think there's an issue here, and you're absolutely right. That's exactly what's happening. But the one issue that I find a little disconcerting for the attacking force, so for the raiders, is you never really knew the quality of the men. You hoped you did. Certainly, if you'd been doing patrolling and taking prisoners, then you'd been interrogating them to try and find out what quality of men you're facing. But very often, in some areas, you'll get whole units would surrender and put their hands up as soon as somebody crested their eyes almost. They realised that the game was up. But in other areas, you have the exact opposite. Units with a esprit de corps, German regiments, battalions, and they would fight it out to the last man. And that's part of the problem. As you crested their eyes, doing whatever it is you're doing, you didn't know what you were going to be facing. Would it be one of the units that they'd surrender fairly quickly, or would it be one that would fight to the last man?
Well, these are interesting aspects that come into play in this battle we're talking about now at Hamel, because this, in many raids, could almost be considered a very big raid. It was a very specific point in the line. There was a coordinated effort to capture it by a fairly limited force. The battle, I mean, I think most people listening to this would, especially the Australians, would know about the Battle of Hamel and that it was spectacularly successful. Everything just worked as it needed to, and the oft-quoted statistic is that it was planned to take 90 minutes and it in fact took 93, and and all these things. And we shouldn't, let's say at the outset, let's not take anything away from the men and the commanders and the men on the ground who it was almost a perfect plan. It was a very thorough and a very good plan which was carried out brilliantly on the ground, and that's what we should say. So this is a very successful action. So let's start with that. What are your comments on that?
Well, I hate that 90 minutes, 93 minutes. No, the comment that Monash planned it for 90 and it was 93 and the battle was over, because of course it's nonsense. The battle wasn't over in 93 minutes. The fighting went on for the rest of the day. It also is nonsense in the sense that at 93 minutes, had we captured every little bit of the objective? No, there were variations, and so you just can't say that. And I think it just confuses the issue. What we should be saying is that the battle went perfectly to plan, and it certainly did. It went perfectly to plan.
Okay, let's talk about the planning and Monash's role in it and all that stuff. Now, I'm not. There is a group of historians today that want to diminish Monash, and I'm absolutely not one of those. I think he was one of the greatest generals Australia ever produced. So let's put that out there. He was a fantastic Corps commander, one of the best in the British Army, I think you would absolutely have to say. Let's talk about the Battle of Hamel, though. It's also important that we discuss the reality of the situation. There is no benefit at all, especially 100 years removed, from turning people into supermen and turning them into saints on the battlefield. Let's talk about the reality of the situation. And the reality was Monash was an outstanding Corps commander and one of the greatest leaders Australia has produced. And this was a wonderful example of just how well he could run a battle. And that is where Hamel sits. It was a small action, but a very good example of how the war should be fought and how the war indeed would be fought for the rest of the year and right up until the end of the First World War. And it did paint a picture of how the Germans could be defeated. But let's also, while paying Monash his dues, let's get some reality in there. All this talk about Monash's masterpiece, 93 minutes that changed the world, etc. What I want to say is Monash was an excellent engineer, and in that same vein, he was a great general. But he was not an innovator in the sense that he invented these techniques. The Australian Corps was always part of the British Army. And what I say about Monash is he was an excellent consolidator of information. And this applied when he was an engineer. He famously built several bridges in Melbourne. When he built those bridges, he didn't wake up in the middle of the night and say, "Egads, I've just come into my head a new way of cementing stones together or the shape of an arch." Or what he did was he consolidated information that was freely available and brought it together in new and interesting ways. So he would read huge amounts of information about how in Europe they were building bridges and a bridge in Asia had done something and a new type of stone was used. And he would bring this information together and then apply it in a novel and interesting way. And that was what he was the master at. And it was exactly the same on the battlefield. So at the Battle of Hamel and at the 8th of August and all these, and Mont St. Quentin and all these other great actions that we remember him for, he was bringing together information that was readily available and constructing it in innovative ways and putting it together very efficiently and very effectively. But these were not unheard of tactics. Everyone knew that this was the way that battles were going to be fought. Close cooperation with tanks, aircraft doing more than they'd done in the past, making the men's job easier as they went in, the innovative use of artillery. This was the way that 1918 was going to be fought. And Hamel was a wonderful example of that. But let's not stray into that territory of thinking that Monash invented all these techniques on his own and this was the only time anyone had thought to apply it. Pete, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing from my point of view is that he had the time here to work it all out. In a lot of the other battles prior to this, there wasn't the time to sit down and really have a good think about it. And you have to say, he sat down and he must have just literally wrote every kind of aspect that he could possibly think of that could go wrong, and how they would then ensure that if things even started to go wrong, they could be corrected on the ground. And so I just found the detail of this attack and the pulling all of that detail together it is extraordinary. But it is, you have to remember, he had the time to do it.
And Monash was absolutely the ultimate micromanager. He would have been a pain in the ass to have to work for. If he was your commanding officer, your life would be miserable. You would be going to meetings 17 times a day to discuss rations and how they should be distributed in the front line. He was the ultimate micromanager. And I'm not saying this as a criticism. This was also why he was successful, is because you see his staff constantly saying how surprised they were that the big man was getting involved in details that they couldn't believe he had the time to even worry about it. Distribution of ammunition, the load that the men would carry, rations, how food was going to get to the front line. Like the minute detail that really a general in his position should not have, even had to worry about. Monash was obsessed with every little detail. So many meetings before this attack. There was a level of frustration. If you read the staff reports about it, there was a level of frustration about the amount of detail that was being called on for this attack. But at the end of the day, you can't argue with the results. I'm a very results-oriented person, and so was Monash, and this worked very, very effectively.
I think one of the issues that I always found fascinating is that, of course, because he viewed that the surprise element was key to all of this, that there was no point in it all, no point in all this kind of detail if the Germans knew they were coming. And so he made sure that literally to the last minute, units that were going to be used in the attack did not know that they were going to be used, because he was concerned that the Germans would raid and capture somebody who would give the whole game away. So I find it fascinating that the training for most of this attack was done in a generic way. It was training for the future without anybody really on the ground. A lot of the men and even some of the battalion commanders not really knowing the detail of exactly when this was going to take place.
And the reason the detail and the planning was so important as well is because of something we've touched on before in the First World War, a lack of communication. It was a modern war, but with primitive communication. So because there was really no way of adjusting the plan once it was kicked off, except on the ground, there was nothing the generals could do once the plan had kicked off. That was why Monash wanted to be so involved in the planning, so that every detail that every influence he could make on the battle was taken care of before the battle began. Once the battle began, Monash was a spectator, because there was nothing that he could particularly do to adjust the outcome. And I want to also add here as well something about the ground which we're going to be walking. All of this planning, all of this intricate meetings and discussions and planning took place at the chateau at Bertong, or Bertangles, which is north of Amiens. And it's one of the things that I love most about when I very, very occasionally do a tour of the battlefields, usually with my what we call the Matt McLachlan signature tour. But I've gotten to know the family that owns that chateau very well. The chateau is still there. And I've gotten to know the family very well. It's still the same family that was there during the war. And we now get access to it, which is fantastic. Only on very limited tours. But if you do one of our sort of flagship tours with Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours, we not only get to go to the chateau, we get to go inside the chateau, we get to walk the grounds, and we get to stand in those rooms where Monash planned and carried out this amazing attack. It's an extraordinary place. And another little dimension to the battle that I love is, and people probably we should do a podcast on some of these behind the lines places, including Bertong Chateau.
I agree entirely. Yeah.
So let's say that about Monash. We're not taking anything away. I think what it is a change in perception about what Monash did. It was absolutely extraordinary what Monash did at Hamel, but I think not for the reasons that we think. He didn't invent these techniques. He implemented them in a very clever way. and then it was acknowledged that it was a very efficient, a very good use. Let's talk about just some of those innovations, Pete, that were employed, not necessarily for the first time, but applied so well at the Battle of Hamel. So I'm thinking about things like carrier tanks. Let's discuss some of these innovations. Let's start with the carrier tanks. That was a really good one.
Well, I think we'll start with tanks full stop and then move to the carriers, because the big issue for Australian troops and tanks was the disaster that was Bullecourt, where they were blamed, that the tanks were blamed as part of the problem. They ran over wounded Australians. There was a lot of issues. And
certainly go back to our podcast from a few weeks ago about Bullecourt and hear all about the disaster of the First Battle of Bullecourt in 1917 and the role the tanks played in that.
Yeah, and I think also there's an issue, again, because there were no Australian tank crew, so they're all Brits. And it just didn't sit very well together, and Monash was aware of that, and he thought, I've just got to sort this out, quite rightly. This needs to be sorted out, because from now on, we are going to be advancing, hopefully, and the tanks are an integral part of the battlefield, and we need to make sure that everybody is happy about that. So he spent a lot of time ensuring that battalions were trained with tanks. They were even allocated tanks to the battalions. The battalions painted their patches on the sides of the tanks so that they would recognise them. Tanks are an issue, actually, on the battlefield. People not that keen on being close to them because they draw fire. But of course, if they're moving as quick as they can do, then they are going to be helpful. And the communication infantry with the tanks working together, it's part of this concept, this all arms battle, and that's what this action is going to be. It's really the first all arms battle, and it's certainly the first one that was written up properly. So in other words, after the battle, then it's going to be written up, and I always view that as a very important aspect of this battle. It's all right having success, but if nobody writes up what went right, because we have a terrible habit of recording what went wrong. And so this is a positive reinforcement, we call it nowadays, is that this needed to be written up and saying, this is what went right, this is what went well, and effectively on the 8th of August, we need to be kind of duplicating this if we're going to have the success that they in fact did have on the 8th of August.
And let's just jump in here to talk about tanks in the First World War, because our perception of tanks is greatly skewed by what happened in the Second World War. We think of blitzkrieg and very high-speed tanks tearing across France in 1940. It's obviously a very different thing in the First World War. Tanks were effectively mobile support units, mobile artillery, mobile machine gun crews, and they were used very effectively in Hamel and in later battles in 1918 for exactly that purpose. So if you were an infantry unit advancing, and you came across a German strong point and there was a German nest of machine guns that was pinning you down and causing casualties, the plan was you could call in a tank to come and take care of that. Whereas 2 years earlier, you would be on your own on that battlefield. You would not be able, there was no way of communicating with the artillery that were kilometres behind you to tell them to shift their fire. There was no way of getting mobile fire onto that strong point, so you simply had to take it with guts and glory. The tanks now gave the infantry mobile support on the battlefield, and that was happening not just with tanks. That was the whole process. Mobility and an independent operation. We'll get into this in a separate podcast because it's a topic I'm fascinated with, but it's quite a complicated topic. But the big change between 1916 and 1918, for example, in my mind, was that units on the ground could adjust the plans as they had to and call on support that could be adjusted on the ground. So that could be things like trench mortars. It could be things like rifle grenades, definitely Lewis guns, the light machine gun that the platoons carried, but also by this stage tanks as well. So that to me is the key point, that if you were a soldier on the ground, you're attacking a German strong point, you're coming under fire, the plan wasn't unrolling as it was supposed to, you now had options. You could call on a tank, you could call on some trench mortars and deal with that strong point on the ground.
Yeah, well, just a little bit. These are Mark Vs, so these are modern, the latest version. So these are a lot more reliable, and that was the main key, that they needed to be more reliable because they broke down a lot. They're also a little faster, so these are doing 7.2 kilometers an hour. So this is still walking speed effectively, but it needs to be, because these are designed to advance with the infantry, and you don't want them racing ahead and the infantry losing sight of them. So, and also this is the attention to detail. Tanks carried spare ammunition and water for the infantry. So this is not a carrier tank specifically designed to carry tons and tons of supplies. This is just a fighting tank. But even the fighting tanks loaded up with as much as they could of water and small arms ammunition so that they could resupply the infantry and just throw it out when they felt it was a good spot to leave some. So it's that attention to detail that is key to this battle.
It's those little attention, as you say, attention to detail, those little points. Water was essential on the battlefield. Imagine you're up all night fighting. It's incredibly tiring and creates an incredible thirst in the men. And getting water to the men in the front line was always a huge challenge during every war, but especially during the First World War. Trying to get them across that ground was always a difficult challenge. And another thing we should say about tanks before we move on is they discovered this during the First World War, and it applies even today. Tanks are excellent at capturing ground and terrible at holding ground. Tanks cannot hold ground. So even if a tank manages to break through and smash the enemy, tanks can capture ground, but they cannot hold it. You always need infantry to come up and consolidate and support the ground that the tanks had just captured. And that was exactly what battles like this one demonstrated. I'm probably getting way too specific here, but it's a fascinating part of... And this is the point that we should start discussing these innovations, that the role that tanks would play in future wars was being established now in battles like the Battle of Hamel. But also talk about the carrier tanks, Pete, because they were pretty fascinating as well.
Well, the carrier tanks were the latest innovation, really. They were designed to carry literally enormous amounts of supplies. Now, I did read the figure yesterday, and I didn't scribble it down. But it's thousands of men. They are replacing, I think, 4 carrier tanks replaced, I think it was 1,200 men.
Each tank carried as many supplies. We're not just talking food and ammunition here. We're talking barbed wire,
everything.
Pickets, duckboards, sandbags. Each carrier tank carried as much as would normally require 1,200 men. So effectively 2 battalions by this stage of the war to bring it up, like a ridiculously large amount of supplies, and then could drop them in pre-designated supply dumps as the ground was taken. And so some of the Australians report that they arrived finding a supply dump already in place in areas that only minutes before had been in German hands. Just absolutely extraordinary.
I'll just give the numbers here. We've got 60 tanks operating during the battle and 4 supply tanks. So 4 supply tanks operating during the fighting.
So just extraordinary stuff. Other innovations, the use of aircraft, Pete. I mean, aircraft had long been recognised as essential on the battlefield and their role. Incredible how quickly they developed. That, it was only a decade that flight had even existed, when powered flight had existed, when the First World War began. But by this stage, only 4 years later, aircraft became essential on the battlefield, didn't they?
Yeah. I mean, previously, they'd been up in the air spotting, effectively, and the fighting going on between the fighters was to protect the spotter plane. So it was all about vision and the need to see what your enemy is doing. Now that's completely changed. I suppose it was the bombing war as well. So if you're going to fly over this is how it started, if you're going to fly over your enemy's trenches, then you might as well throw something out while you're crossing over the trenches. And of course, we now have proper bombers. London had been attacked in 1917, but the big innovation here is basically the fighter bomber. That's what it is. It's ground strafing. It's the fighter, not the fighter bomber. The fighter, the aircraft that just comes down and strafs your enemy. And so this is what they're being used for. Obviously, you can't do that in the dark, but the minute that it became light, then they were attacking targets. So you've got tanks attacking targets, you've got the aircraft attacking targets, and you've got artillery being used against specific targets, all being indicated by a variety of smoke bombs or other methods. So again, if you plan it properly, then somebody is going to come to your aid if you need help.
Resupply as well was also a novel use of aircraft in this stage. This was one of the first times that ammunition was dropped from aircraft, not particularly successfully and not in large numbers, but in a couple of key points, particularly those Lewis gun drums, which were essential to keep the troops going forward. A few small ammunition drops were actually made from aircraft.
Yeah, so these are being dropped by parachute. What's fascinating, again, we talked about Monash and his attention to detail. He was interested. He wanted to know, well, how did it work? How on earth did you drop something out of an aeroplane by a parachute? Did you pull a lever? And so he became involved. He went to go and have a look. It's his engineering background. He went to go and have a look and see how this lever worked. What did it actually do to drop a case of ammunition to frontline soldiers? So yes, again, used as soon as it became daylight, they were resupplied by the air. So attention to detail.
It would be remiss of us to not talk about the artillery as well. It's the huge irony of the First World War is the artillery is probably the essential weapon on the battlefield, the weapon that caused the most casualties, the weapon that was responsible for attacks failing or succeeding. Yet one of the things that gets most overlooked, it wasn't a particularly glorious war to be a gunner in the artillery, kilometres behind the line, sending over these massive shells, but by God, it was essential, particularly in 1918. And again, innovative use of artillery. Gary Sheffield, the great historian who we both know well, Pete, I was reading a paper that he'd written the other day about success in 1918, and he was talking about specific fuse innovations in artillery shells, just making the shells more reliable, making them explode when you wanted them to. that innovation in artillery shell fuses was probably much more important to Allied success in the First World War than the introduction of the tank. But of course, he makes the point that it's much less sexy to be talking about artillery fuses than tanks rolling across the battlefield. But the use of artillery was an art by this stage of the war. And as we would see, particularly in battles, the one that followed this, the 8th of August, artillery essential and incredibly effectively used.
I think the barrage maps for this battle and for others really starting in 1917, and the barrage maps are for creeping barrages, so protecting the infantry as they're advancing. The barrage is moving in front of them. It's extraordinary. The technical, I suppose, the technical use of the guns, because a gunner in the past, he saw his enemy, he fired at it, and I'm going to really to 1914, the early fighting of 1914. The guns still prepared to see the enemy. Here, they're not seeing the enemy at all. They're firing from map shoots, and they're all firing at the same time, and they're all raising their barrels at the same time so that the barrage moves forward with the infantry. The technical aspect of it is mind-boggling. But of course, we've now got something else as well. We've got machine guns doing the same thing. Machine guns have been put into effectively batteries, and they are working and doing the exact same thing. So what we have are barrages of machine gun fire also supporting the infantry. These are the Vickers machine guns firing over the heads.
It's incredible, isn't it, to think of that, is that firing in an arc over the heads of their troops and then having the rain of bullets coming down on the enemy. Just be awful to be underneath it. But from the artillery perspective, some incredible innovations going on. Triangulation was hugely important. Counter battery fire was hugely important. So the idea that a very large proportion of your guns were not necessarily intended to blow up Germans in the front line. They were to take out the German artillery, and the science of triangulation to identify batteries, where exactly the Germans would be, was extraordinary. I mean, they report in this battle, and particularly in the follow-up to August the 8th, which was really an expanded version of Hamel, they report that German gun crews who had never been fired on and thought they were completely camouflaged and completely safe were astounded to find that shells just started dropping on their head the second the barrage opened up. So the Allies, and the Germans as well, but the Allies particularly, were able to pinpoint via a range of sources, aircraft, spotting, triangulation on the ground. They were able to identify German batteries, which they would not fire on until the battle began. And then these poor German gunners all of a sudden found that they were getting smashed around by the artillery. Just extraordinary.
It's all become fairly technical as well in this department. We have sound ranging and flash spotting. In the old days, it was a bloke kind of with a megaphone trying to figure out where that noise came from, and two of them triangulating a position. And now it's technical equipment using photographic film, and it's a really technical a technical aspect of the artillery. And so sound ranging, flash spotting meant that really if you fired at any time prior to a battle, then hopefully your gun would be plotted by our teams, and then the counter battery fire would come down on it. And this battle is a prime example. Most of the German guns that would have been used to try and protect the German front line were taken out by counter battery fire 10 minutes before the battle.
There's something that gets mentioned about the artillery as well, which to me was more of a novelty but still quite effective, was the idea that in the days leading up to the attack, they would do sort of spontaneous artillery barrages, and they would mix deliberately. The Allies would mix smoke in with gas shells, so they would fire a large proportion of gas shells, but they would also fire smoke shells as well. And in the weeks leading up to the attack, it conditioned the Germans that if they saw smoke, there was also going to be gas mixed in with it as well, and they'd have to put their gas masks on. And so on the morning of the battle, I love these little innovations. The morning of the Battle of Hamel, they fired the smoke without the gas, yet the Germans still expected the gas attack, so they put their gas masks on. Because, of course, the issue with gas is it's fantastic at clearing out the German lines, but it also makes it impossible for your troops to then get in and occupy those trenches. So they couldn't have that situation at Hamel, so they just fired the smoke shells. The Germans expected a gas attack, put their gas masks on, and the Australians reported in some numbers that they were taking German prisoners wearing their gas masks, even though gas had not been used particularly broadly during the attack.
I think fighting with the gas mask on is my idea of hell. It really is. Even in a modern war, if you put on your respirator, your vision is much reduced. No matter what you do, you still tend to have an element of steaming up. In the First World War, with their gas masks, then they would always steam up, and the PH gas hoods, which thankfully have now gone, were almost useless because they steamed up completely. Now with their respirators, at least they could see, but it's much better not to wear a respirator. And of course, the Germans were wearing theirs, and our attacking troops were not, because they knew they were not going into gas. So a great innovation and part of Monarchy's attention to detail.
Also, other little things that I like were as the tanks rolled up, they used very old, noisy aircraft to swoop low over the German lines to mask the sound of the approaching tanks. It just, innovations that just, made a huge difference. And it was a clever battle. That's what I always say about Hamel. It was very clever. It was a clever employment of the technology that was available.
My favourite, and I think this really shows attention to detail, there were certain areas that were very flat in the Battle of Hamel, and they knew that the infantry would have to advance across these flat areas facing German machine guns with no cover. So they deliberately, a combination of bombs and shells, created craters in the field. Now these were designed, they were not trying to kill Germans, these are designed to create cover for attacking infantry. So as the infantry advanced, they would know where these craters were, because what they did then, they then flew over the craters, plotted where they are, and so the battalions as they attacked knew where these craters would be, so if they came under fire, they knew they could head for a crater to get some shelter. I just think that attention to detail is extraordinary.
Well, Pete, I think it's worthy of discussing these aspects of the battle because it's such a fascinating battle and such a detailed battle. Let's get out and walk the ground, because I should say as well that it's not particularly, the ground hasn't changed very much from 1918. It's the beauty of walking these isolated battlefields in little farming regions. They don't actually change that much over the centuries. So let's get out and walk the ground, because it's one of my favourites to get out. You can paint the picture of what was going on in this battle by walking the ground. And the other thing I should mention as well, by the time of these 1918 battles, it wasn't the static trench lines that had been there for 2 or 3 years that we saw earlier in the war. There was a lot of open fighting. It was fighting from position to position. So therefore, when you walk the battlefield today, you do get a really good sense of what the troops went through, because it wasn't just leaving a trench and marching across no man's land. They were fighting from position to position. And that's exactly what we see at Hamel today. So let's walk the ground, Pete. Let's fill our flasks with a refreshing coffee. Let's strap our boots on. Let's get out in the battlefield. Where are we starting?
Okay, so we're going to park our car by a crucifix on the edge of a village called Vers-sur-Corbie, and we're going to walk up a track, and that track will take us through the Australian lines, up onto a hill known as Hill 104, and into no man's land, and just beyond no man's land we hit a trench known as Pear Trench. Now at this point on the battlefield, Pear Trench is actually in this little road. It's slightly sunken, and so we're going to stop there. Behind us, I'm going to turn to face the direction of attack, so that's turning left, and we're going to look into a valley, and there's a valley directly in front of us with a wood on the skyline. To the left, slightly half left, we can see the village of Hamel. Beyond it, we can see a ridge, and that is known as the Wolfberg. That is the final objective. To the right, we can see a little copse, first of all, and that's called Central Copse. And then beyond it, and slightly left, 2 woods now joined together into one big wood, and it's Hamel and Ver Wood. So all of these are important objectives, but actually we are standing in probably where some of the hardest fighting took place, and this is in Pear Trench. Now, as we just discussed slightly earlier, these are not trenches in the sense of what we would have expected in 1916 or even in 1917, where we have basically a trench that runs from the Channel. If we want to be silly, it runs from the Channel to the Alps and there's no breaks in it. That's long since gone. What we now have are what are known as redoubt positions. They have all-round defence, they have a few machine guns. So Pear Trench is just a length of trench that doesn't appear to be really connected with anything else, but it is, because the fire from Pear Trench is enfilading. In other words, it's coming in from the side of those troops that are trying to attack down through the valley and up towards the woods. So this is where some of the really serious fighting took place at Pear Trench, because here we do have some of those machine gunners that we were talking about, guys that wouldn't give in. They fought to the last, and we get some really tough fighting here right at the start of the battle.
Now, Pete, I'm going to confess to being a bit of a numpty here, because I've known about Pear Trench for a very long time, for several decades, and it was only relatively recently that I was looking at a trench map and noted the German positions, and that the trench at Pear Trench was shaped very much like a pear, like the fruit, which is obviously why it was given the name. And it had never occurred to me before but when you look at a trench map, you absolutely see that. Something we've been remiss in not mentioning to this point, Pete, and it does come into effect here greatly, is the Americans had also attacked alongside the Australians. That about 1,000 American troops were also brought in. One of the first actions Americans fought on the Western Front. And there's a whole story about how the Americans were supposed to fight in larger numbers, and then the American commanders withdrew them, etc., etc. But about 1,000 Americans went into the attack here alongside the Australians, one of the first times that American troops took part in an attack of this nature. And that's why Monash chose the 4th of July as the date for this attack, to really fire up the Americans who were attacking alongside. They didn't play a huge role in the battle. They were not particularly effective in the battle. But it was handy to have the American troops there to bolster the Australian numbers. And they did attack in that region around Pear Trench.
I think it's important. It's important for the future because as the Australian Corps fights onwards towards the end of the war, it is going to shrink in size considerably, and the Americans are going to increase in size considerably, and they are going to be fighting side by side alongside the Australians. So this is the start, the first day really of that cooperation between America and Australia. In fact, it's also famous because the very first Medal of Honor was awarded during this attack. So the very first American to be awarded the US Medal of Honor, then he is awarded it during the fighting here.
So let's talk about the fighting around Pear Trench, because it was quite interesting, and it's a great spot to stand and as you say, observe the battlefield, but also to think about the fighting that occurred here. I should also mention there's a photo, we'll put the photo up on the Facebook pages and the Twitter feed. There's a famous photo of a dead German medical soldier lying outside a trench taken during the Battle of Hamel, one of the most famous photos from Hamel, and that was taken at Pear Trench. And so let's talk about some of the fighting here, Pete.
Yeah, there's also another photo, and maybe there's the same one, Matt, I'm not sure, but there's another photo which actually is exactly where we're standing. So it's in this sunken road. It's in the section, and you can see on both sides of the sunken road there are sections of German trench. So fighting very tough here, and as in all of these battles, you'll need individuals to help keep things moving. And the German guns here enfilading the advance needed to be taken out. The men had been driven into the ground. And one man who is going to be awarded the Victoria Cross, and this is where it gets tricky because his name is debatable as to how you pronounce it. So Henry Deal. I always say Dalziel because that's what it looks like, but that is definitely not how you pronounce it.
I took his family around this battlefield several years ago, which was a great honour, and I still contact them occasionally. And I called him Dalziel as well. It's spelled Dalziel, and I was just calling him Dalziel. They corrected me. But the problem is I cannot remember. The correction made absolutely no sense to the spelling of the name, and I cannot remember how they pronounce it. It was either Delish or it was DL, but it was not Dalziel. But anyway, Harry, we'll go with DL.
Yeah, he's an interesting character and very good. I'm going to read the citation because it's such a good fighting citation. So, for most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty when in action with the Lewis gun section. So this is one thing we mentioned earlier. Lewis guns crucial in every battle from now on, every action from now on. The Lewis gun is what is going to help us. It's a weapon that can be fired from the hip, not commonly fired from the hip. You were not really trained to fire it from the hip. It's got a bipod at the front, and you lay down and you fired it. But they discovered that in the half light, and I should also say this was planned to give you about 18 meters of vision. This whole battle, again, that detail, 18 meters should be enough for you to be able to tell whether that man that's at 80 meters is an enemy or a friend. And so the Lewis gun fired from the hip, a leather strap around the neck to the front of it, so it gives it extra support. And that's an awful lot more Lewis guns used during this attack. So Henry is commanding a Lewis gun section, and his company met with determined resistance from a strong point which was strongly garrisoned, manned by numerous machine guns and undamaged by artillery fire. It was also protected by strong wire entanglements. A heavy concentration of machine gun fire caused many casualties and held up our advance. His Lewis gun having come into action and silenced enemy guns in one direction, an enemy gun opened fire from the other direction. He dashed at it and with his revolver killed or captured the entire crew and gun and allowed our advance to continue. He was severely wounded in the hand, but carried on and took part in the capture of the final objective. He twice went over open ground and under heavy enemy artillery and machine gun fire to secure ammunition, and though suffering from considerable loss of blood, he filled magazines and saved his gun until severely wounded through the head. His magnificent bravery and devotion to duty was an inspiring example to all of his comrades. There's a little bit more, but I'll stop there. Just quickly talk about the wound to his head. It's extraordinary that he survived, because apparently his brain was showing, but he went on to have to recover fully and have a healthy life. His own.
I'd also read with the hand wound as well, Pete. I'd also read that he had his trigger finger shot away. That he actually lost a finger in that attack. When they say severely wounded in the hand, although his family member said that wasn't the case, that he did have all his digits. But I think the wound in the hand mangled his fingers quite severely. Was the general consensus? So much so that his comrades thought he'd actually lost a finger. So, but I mean, imagine what a bullet going through the fingers or the hand is going to do a lot of damage, and again, hit in the head as well. I mean, this attack reminds me a lot of Barcelona in Guadalcanal in World War II. The idea that just one man was everywhere doing everything, not only attacking positions and killing the enemy and bringing the line forward, but then running back and getting ammunition and coming and reloading the Lewis guns. He was just everywhere doing everything. And as we said, these are the great Victoria Cross citations, because they're just, how is he ever going to do anything except receive the Victoria Cross for an action like this? Just extraordinary.
I think these are guys that really get it into their head that they're going to do during the fighting absolutely everything they can to keep their comrades alive, because that's what this is about. This is about ensuring that he's keeping alive his comrades, his Lewis gun teams, and also he wants to go home, as all of them did. And there is this big change, and that's something we should have mentioned earlier in this attack, that everybody is on a high. This is an attack which basically is our turn. It's our turn. This is the start of an element of revenge, you would have to say, of pushing the Germans back. So this is a really buoyant attack. These guys are wanting to get to grips with the Germans. Of course, not everybody is. You have to say, not everybody feels like that. But in the main, this has been instilled within them in their training prior to this attack, that this was our turn. This is we are going to win this war, and we are going to force them back.
You're right what you say too about that feeling of retribution against the Germans, because several reports, particularly from battles like Villers-Bretonneux, which had taken place a couple of months earlier, but one issue that the officers had was trying to hold the men back. That once the men got going against the Germans, they wanted to keep going, and there was a lot of scores that were settled in these battles. It's awful to think about what that means. It means killing and death and getting sometimes a very brutal revenge. But that was a big element here, that they felt after all these years of trenches and mud and being away from their families, that they were finally going to give the Germans the kick up the bum that they deserved. And so there was quite a level of retribution and score settling which took place in these battles. Really quite horrific when you think about what that means on the ground.
There's an interesting account. This is his own personal account of this action, and I'll just read it. We were harassed by a murderous fire from the nearby enemy stronghold. The Australian advance was held up. My gun had cleared up one machine gun nest, but the other, planted in a different direction, opened fire. I dashed at it, killing 7 Germans with my 2 revolvers. Now, that gives you this imagery of him attacking with a revolver in one hand. I personally don't think that's what he actually meant. I think that trying to reload was very difficult, and I think he probably had just 2 revolvers, and he would drop one and then draw the other one and carry on shooting. Maybe. He may have had a revolver in each hand, I'm not sure. One German bloodhound wounded me in the hand, so this is when he was hitting the hound, but I soon had him on the ground. I lunged at him with my German dagger, so that tells you that at this point he hasn't got any revolvers, he's dropped everything, and he's using a dagger, catching him right over the heart. His dying cry upset me, and I shivered. So he's actually plunged his a German dagger, which he must have picked up as a souvenir and was using as a fighting dagger. We now call them fighting daggers, and killed him in hand-to-hand combat. So the citation, the official citation, doesn't really tell the whole story, and I think that's his own personal account is a much more interesting account.
Doesn't reveal a lot about the fighting at this stage as well, about men innovating. These are experienced fighters now. These guys have been fighting for a long time, about what they would take into the battle. We see this all the time with soldiers, about what they felt they needed in a battle. He was a Lewis gunner, so therefore he wasn't carrying a rifle because he had the quite bulky Lewis machine gun. Even if he wasn't personally carrying it, he was responsible for directing them. So he was carrying, as he said, 2 revolvers, deciding that even 1 revolver wasn't enough, so he's carrying 2 revolvers, and a German dagger, which he felt was going to be handy in a tight spot, and evidently was. So just brutal fighting. I also saw a quote from this man, DL, Dalziel. He went back many years later, he went back. I think it was in the 30s. He went back to the battlefield and walked the ground. And it's almost quite sad. His account. He said, "I couldn't." He went here to where we're standing. He went to this sunken road to Pear Trench. He said, "I just couldn't find anything that I recognised. It just seemed to be a different place." And there was even a note of sadness in his just in that account that he felt estranged from that action that had taken place 20 or 30 years earlier. So I always love those stories of veterans returning to the battlefield and walking in the footsteps as we are right now.
Of course, you have to imagine the state he would have been in, adrenaline pumping, and this is dark. This is still dark, half light, I suppose. So it would still be you can imagine all flashes and imagery and gunfire and noise, and you're just not going to be able to repeat that. And it's not going to feel the same standing in an open paddock as we are now, looking across a peaceful landscape to a beautiful wood. Well, it hasn't changed, as we said earlier again. This landscape has not changed. The wood is in the same place. The road is in the same place. Everything's in the village hasn't even grown. The village is the same size. In fact, the population is less now than it had been prior to the Great War. So nothing has changed at all, but it would certainly feel very different nowadays to that night.
A reflection on the mental stresses of combat as well is that, when your blood is high and you're charging in and fighting for your life, it's going to be very different. Anyone who's been through a trauma would note that it's going to feel very different when you look back on it. And again, there's some wonderful photographs at this time that the photographic technology was advancing and the importance of photographs was acknowledged. And there's a photo that I really love, which to me sums up everything that was going on, which is a picture of a captured German trench mortar position on the morning of the battle after the fighting had stopped. Just with Australians draped over every corner they can, sound asleep. They've been up all night. The strain of combat was immense, and it's reflected well in that photo of them just sleeping in the summer sun wherever they can find a spot.
They're actually stretcher bearers, so I think they're absolutely exhausted from basically going backwards and forwards to the front line and back, to the front line and back, taking men back, their battalion stretcher bearers. So I know exactly the photo you're talking about. It's a great photo. And what's interesting, that mortar didn't open fire. That German mortar still has the cover on it, the leather cover that covered the barrel. So it didn't even have the opportunity to open fire. It was overrun before it could be used.
So where to next on the walk, Pete? I think Pear Trench is an absolutely fascinating spot on the battlefields in general, and there's more to come on this battlefield.
Right, Pear Trench now swings away on our right-hand side, so you have to imagine that we've broken through Pear Trench and we're heading down into the bottom of the valley, and we have this little bushy area on the right-hand side, and again, very clever planning by the Germans. This is Kidney Trench. And I know you're going to tell me that this one's in the shape of a kidney, which I hadn't noticed, but it probably is. And so Kidney Trench on our right-hand side is in the bushes, and it's still, we can imagine exactly where it is. Obviously, there's nothing there now, but we know exactly where it was, and you can imagine it being there in this little copse of trees. So just 2 or 3 trees. Again, there's a few low trees here as well. And as we walk down the road, we would have been fired at from the flank, from the right-hand side. So again, it's going to take individuals to take this section of the trench. Heavy casualties, not heavy casualties. Relatively speaking, this is not a battle of heavy casualties, but casualties again taken by the machine guns there. It's a little nest of machine guns, but it's going to be taken out. And again, we have an individual act of a Lance Corporal, Thomas, he was actually known as Jack Axford, who will be awarded the Victoria Cross. Now, I have to say that these are the 15th Deal was the 15th Battalion, and Axford is the 16th Battalion, so both from the same brigade here. And that's one thing I should have also said. 3 brigades being utilised during this fighting, but they're from different divisions. And again, it's Monash deciding, let's mix it up a bit. Let's not use one division in this attack. Let's use brigades from several divisions. So what we're doing, we're giving experience to the different divisions, and we're also making sure that the losses then are not all piled upon one division as well.
So this is quite a long walk, Pete. We're walking the ground towards the village now, across the battlefield once we leave Kidney Trench. We're going to walk up now, actually covering the ground the Australians did, literally walking in the footsteps of the attacking Australians and Americans. Where are we heading to next?
Yep, so we're now, we have the woods in front of us, and actually we're going to come out as a place where it was the German route in and out of the battlefield, so it was known as Hun's Walk. Again, Monash is planning, because he knew that this Hun's Walk directly in front of us, this little route through the woods, this little track that runs through the woods, he made sure that this was bombarded during the fighting very heavily. It meant that the Germans couldn't withdraw through it, and also we took a lot of prisoners, and also it meant that the Germans couldn't resupply. So we're not going to walk that way. We could, and if you've got lots of time, you can walk up that way as well, walk through the wood to the ridge. But we're going to hang a left here and walk on the road back towards the village of Hamel. So we're heading towards Hamel itself, which, as I said, has not changed. Destroyed in the fighting, very badly damaged, but size-wise, rebuilt. It's been rebuilt on exactly the same footprint. You would recognise it. If you were a soldier returning, then you would definitely recognise the outline of it and the footprint of the village itself.
So tell us about walking into the village, Pete, because, again, another famous photo. This battle was very well documented with photographs. There's a famous photo of a tank rolling through the village of Hamel, echoes of the tank in 1916 rolling through your village of Fleur. Tell us about the village.
Apart from very few of the tanks during this action broke down, we don't get any knocked out. I think 2 of them had problems, but no tanks completely destroyed in this fighting. And so there's a very famous picture of the tank rolling through the village. And interestingly, most of it has been rebuilt, but there's just some big gates and part of a wall that are still there. It's exactly the same. So it's one of the only places where you can stand and say, yep, this tank was right alongside this bit of the wall. It's almost opposite the church. The church had gone. Church is always destroyed because of the vision issues with them, people up in the towers, so they're always targeted. So the church here had been taken out by our artillery. The Germans within the town itself, they were overwhelmed very, very quickly. A lot of them took shelter in the cellars, and this action is going on so fast that the Germans are not ever really able to say for certain where the Australians are. They can hear the tanks coming and they can see the Australian infantry, and at this point the Australian infantry was ahead of the tanks. The tanks couldn't keep up, and it gives you an indication really that they were also a little slow in getting to the start of the battle, they catch up, and as we discussed, they are used when they are needed. So that communication. I'm just going to go off on a tangent because it's just something I found fascinating. I once had a long conversation with an Australian that I was taking on tour, and he was absolutely adamant that his relative had fought in a tank during the Battle of Hamel. And I was absolutely adamant that there were no Australian tank crew. So I said he must have been involved in that period of training, because he had a picture of him. He told me, and he showed me it, a picture of him standing in the door of a tank, standing by the entrance to a tank. But he said, no, he was definitely, and I said, no, he definitely was not. Well, damn me, reading in the last few months more about the battle, I found just a simple little comment, and it was a request for Lewis gunners to be attached to tanks temporarily because there were not enough Lewis gunners available in the tank corps, and they wanted some Australians to add some more firepower to the tanks that would be put inside the tanks. So he was absolutely right. So this poor old bloke, I'd been arguing with him that his relative had not ever served in the tank. His relative obviously did. He must have been a Lewis gunner attached to a tank during the fighting.
Bad luck for him. That was not a good role to be. I mean, the tanks did well here, but it was that was not a great day when you were allocated to be on the crew of a First World War tank. I really like the village of Hamel. It's a lovely little place. It's a cute little village. I mean, all these villages are much the same, but it's you know, it's got the hill behind it. It's a nice village, and I've got to do a big shout out to my friends in Hamel, the people in Hamel. We again, a little tangent, but I think people appreciate it, is that when we run tours, which we do every Anzac Day, to the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux, which is just down the road from Hamel. We always, in the early days of running the tours, had an issue with breakfast, because we would pack breakfast boxes, which people would then tend to eat at 3 o'clock in the morning and then be hungry by the time that the service was over. Or then should we go back to the hotel for breakfast? It was always a big issue. And then one day I was chatting to some people from the village of Hamel, and my dear friend Tom Morgan was actually the one that suggested this. He was one of the historians on the tour. We were chatting to the people of Hamel, and poor old little Hamel, in spite of its significance to Australians, gets badly overlooked on Anzac Day because all the action is happening at Villers-Bretonneux. And so we spoke to the local people and we said, would you like to host our tour group for breakfast? And we've done it now for 12 or 13 years, probably it's been. Not obviously at the moment with COVID, but up until that point. And it's one of the absolute highlights. So I just want to say a shout out to the wonderful people of Hamel. We do it in the school hall next to the church. The kids make pictures of kangaroos and koalas and write notes which they put on the wall, and if it's a school day, the kids are all there. They come in early and they sing Australian songs, and the local people are there making coffee and baguettes and croissants, and none of them speak English, and very few of our people speak French. And the mayor comes down and makes a speech in French, and it's just the most extraordinary connection with the local people, which I think is something that you can potentially miss if you're just travelling around at a breakneck speed, just seeing battlefield sites. And so a huge shout out to the wonderful people of Hamel, very close to my heart, and one of the absolute highlights of visiting the battlefields on Anzac Day.
Yeah, I miss it terribly, and it is great, and it's very, very French. It's very ad hoc, and you never quite know quite exactly how it's going to work, but it works very well, and the food is excellent, and the coffee is very needed, having stood all night. So it's brilliant. It's really good. A sad little aspect. And I noticed that several. I've been quickly flicking through some guidebooks before we started this podcast, and quite a few of them mentioned the bar in the village. Well, sadly, it's no more. The bar is now a house. It's gone, as an awful lot of the bars in the villages in northern France have hit the dust. So I miss it terribly. That ability to have a coffee and a beer if you wish as a break in your touring. So you have to now carry it all with you, and so we'll be carrying our coffee with us, and we're going to head up through the village now towards the village war memorial. So this is the start of the climbing ground, which will eventually take us up to the Wolfberg, which is the German strong point, their final objective, in fact where the command structure was based. And we're past the war memorial. I always stop and have a look at the French village war memorials. Always worthwhile having a look at them. And this one is particularly nice, and it nearly always flies the Australian flag as well, commemorating this battle. And not just on Anzac Day, there's normally an Australian flag flying beside the war memorial. And we're heading now uphill, very steep climb, a sunken road, so there's a ridge at both sides of us, and we're heading to the Australian Corps Memorial Park. Now, I could spend a whole podcast discussing the Corps Memorial Park because, in my view, it is one of the best and sites organised from Australia, built by Australians. Well, actually, not necessarily built by Australians, but certainly employing local contractors to build it, but it is superbly designed and planned. But this is not its first carnation. This is its second one. What do you think about this one, Matt?
I agree. It's an absolutely fascinating spot. I mean, it's a beautiful memorial which commemorates the Australians. There's original trenches, probably one of the few places on the Western Front where we know trenches that were dug and occupied by Australians. The ones at Guardicore as well, I think they're Australian too. But one of the few places on the Western Front. I'm going to do a shout out here to John Laffan, the historian who died many years ago. John Laffan was one of the reasons that I got interested in all this sort of stuff. I read all his early books, and he's been decried greatly since he passed away, which is not unjustified. He was not a perfect character, but he was responsible for in a big part for this memorial. He led the initiative that said the Australians don't have a place where there's preserved battlefield that commemorates the Australians. So in the 1990s, he was a driving force behind this. So whatever you think about John Laffan, and as I said, he's quite reviled these days. People are not a fan at all of John Laffan. But whatever you think of John Laffan, I think we should remember that he was a big driving force behind this, and his motives were pure about keeping Australians interested in the battlefield. So I do want to do a shout out. He was a very early influence on me, and I remember as a teenager reading his books, and I wrote a letter to him, and he kindly wrote back, and that was a big influence on me. That John Laffan was out there and remembering the Aussies at a time when other people weren't. So his reputation has changed since he passed away, but this is a good spot to remember him.
I think everything's changed, really. I mean, he was a leading light in the lions led by donkeys kind of aspect of the war, and now very much reviled, not probably too strong, but it's not seen as accurate. But I have several of his books on my bookshelves, and I think it's necessary to have them to see how thought and things have changed. So I agree completely with you, Matt. I think he's part of the story of remembering the Great War, and it's now remembered in a very different way as to how he remembered it and how he wrote about it. I didn't ever meet him, but I met his wife several times. He had a Belgian wife. I've met her a few times. So when was this created? Well, originally it was created or inaugurated, I suppose, on the 4th of July in 1998. Now, that is not what we're looking at. As I said, this is the second incarnation of the site. It basically was not well looked after in its first appearance. It started to look dowdy and run down, and because of that, it attracted the wrong type of people. It wasn't policed, and so we would get the youth up there and a little bit of graffiti and a bit of damage, and then it literally started falling to bits itself. It had enormous marble panels on this curving wall, and those marble panels started to drop off, so they fastened bits of wire around it to try and stop it. Oh, and it was just a terrible mess. And thankfully, what happened is, rather than attempting to patch it up, they demolished the whole site. The whole site was demolished, and it was completely rebuilt and inaugurated on the 8th of November 2008 by Quentin Bryce. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. And in fact, it's one of those locations, because there are explanatory panels about every aspect of the battle, or most aspects of the battle. If I was being really lazy, I could just kick my clients out and say, well, go and read those panels, it tells you the whole thing. And it does. And it's just so well designed, and I just like every aspect of it. And the views are phenomenal. It's even got a toilet. That is so rare on the battlefield.
It's you're right, everything you say. I mean, it is you could sum up 1918, at least the Australian experience of 1918, from this one point. You can see there, from there you can just see the top of the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. You can swing around and see the Somme Valley, which was crucial in the fighting of 1918. You can see the chimney stack where the Red Baron's plane crashed. You can see it from there, which if you don't have time to go to the Red Baron's site, you can at least see it from this spot. And then you've got these wonderful preserved trenches. You can see the whole Hamel battlefield, of course, and talk about the Battle of Hamel. And then when you swing around and face east from these trenches, those are the trenches from which the famous Battle of Amiens, the 8th of August, the Great Attack, the Black Day of the German Army, that's where it began. And in the distance, looking to the east, you can see the church spire at Proyard, which was effectively where that battle ended on the 9th of August. So this period of 1918, the 100 days, can really be summed up from this spot. And indeed, when I'm touring the battlefields and I have to take people, it's very difficult to sum up on the ground the entirety of the 100 days, this advance to the end of the war. So usually I do it from this memorial at Hamel because it paints it in front of you like a portrait. And interestingly, that you were talking about the rebuilding of the memorial, it was fascinating how they went about it, because the original memorial with the black granite also featured inscribed on it was that famous photograph of Monash was replicated on the memorial. And a lot of people objected to that an individual would be featured so prominently on a war memorial. So that was removed, and now it's simply words. But even the orientation was changed, I think, Pete. I think the memorial originally faced in a completely different direction.
It faced to the park, to where you park your car. It actually faced to the car park, which, yes, okay, you could see, you got out your car and you could see it straight away. Now it faces direction that the Australian troops came from. It's got an enormous great rising sun badge in the middle. It is so classy now, whereas before, you have to say, it had a little bit of an element of Mickey Mousey about it. It felt cartoony. It didn't feel... It just didn't feel right somehow, and it was very different to everything else on the battlefield anywhere. Well, I have to say, on almost any battlefield anywhere. And now it just feels right. It just feels imposing. It's clever. It doesn't use up too much land. There's parking areas. There's a place you can have a picnic. So they literally built picnic benches. So with school groups, very often we'll have our picnic here. Just the whole thing. There are seating around the actual memorial. This big rising sun with an inscription that the French president. I'll read that in a second. What he said, and you can literally sit a whole school group, a whole coachload of people, and stand in the middle and do a lecture, and then just beside it are these little preserved trenches, this redoubt position, and I tend to go into a whole talk on redoubt positions and how you use them and where the machine guns will be placed. So you can do so many things there, and then, as Matt said, turn round and talk about the 100 days, and you can see a Crouch Wood from there, one of the first objectives of the 8th of August. So fantastic site, and sadly missed by a lot of people because it doesn't fit well into a route. And so a lot of people go from Villers-Bretonneux to Albert, and they may point it out from the ridge opposite where the Red Baron was shot down. But it is missed by a lot of people who are on fairly tight schedules, and it is, in my view, absolutely essential that you visit this site.
And the preserved trenches, of course. They're not preserved trenches. They're original trenches that they filled in with stones to keep them in place. One thing I actually like to do when I'm there is if you duck into the little scrubby patch behind the memorial, the trenches continue through there. And so you can actually see these original trenches, originally dug by the Germans and then occupied by the Australians after their victory here. So an essential site. Really great. Let's hear what the French president had to say, Pete, which is now inscribed on the memorial.
I have to say, I'm not a particular fan of this, and it's essential that it's written down because it is exactly what he said, and he was overjoyed with what had happened because he could see that this was the start of the end in this area and the start of us rolling up the German line. So this is what he said. When the Australians came to France, the French people expected a great deal of you. We knew that you would fight a real fight. But we did not know that from the very beginning you would astonish the whole continent. I shall go back tomorrow and say to my countrymen, I have seen the Australians, I have looked in their faces, I know that these men will fight alongside of us again until the cause for which we are fighting is safe for us and for our children. You have to say, it's brilliant. But my only slight problem with it is that we knew that you would fight a real fight. And I just wonder, what is it saying about everybody else? So I suppose I turn it round a little bit. It's kind of a great, it's a great slap on the back for the Australians, but what is it saying about everybody else? So I always have a kind of a look at it sometimes and I think, I'm not sure. But it is a great compliment to the Australians fighting here, certainly at Hamel and elsewhere, of course.
It's also probably unique that the Australians would take the opportunity to say that we did a good job somewhere during the First World War, because I don't know if you've noticed, but us Australians are incredibly humble, and we like to just remember that we were part of a team and that we just did our small part. Obviously, I'm being ridiculous here. We Aussies love the suggestion that we won the First World War. I'm not even saying this in an offensive way to any Australian. I mean, as Aussie, I will beat my chest as much as anyone, but it's a great Australian tradition to get over there and to say that all you Poms would be speaking German if it wasn't for us, and to actively believe it. And good on us for this is a moment where we where we beat our chests hard. But I mean, every nation needs to do that. And as we've said in our previous podcast, I think New Zealand is probably the only country that doesn't claim that they won the war with their one little division. But I think every country needs that spot to say this was where we did great things, and there's no better spot than that for that than Hamel. Much more, I think, than the even the Australian National Memorial. You know, in terms of a spot where you can stand and just remember what a great job the Aussies did. This is the one on the battlefields.
This is a great spot. I have to say, having said all of that we've just discussed, it's unusual that it has so many flags flying here, because we have an American flag, we have the British flag, we have the French flag, and we have the Australian flag. So we have the four flags, and the Canadian flag. And I think,
did we mention the Canadians?
No, the Canadians not there. So the Canadians their flag doesn't fly there. So it's interesting.
I'm going to look that up. I'm pretty sure the Canadian flag flies there. But Pete, you go there more than I do. So
because how I always look at it is the Brits are on the left, so you've got the British flag. So effectively, we're on the other side of the river. The Americans are here, so their flag is there. The French, it's their country, and of course the Australians, because they're here. Oh, does it have the Canadian flag? Oh, it might have. And then the Canadian flag might be on. Now I'm not sure. Now you've said that, is the Canadian flag on the other side because the Canadians were on the right? Because the Canadians were on the right. Oh, damn. You might be right. I'm going to have to check.
We're going to have a look. We're going to have to look this up now. See, this is the joy. People who think that these are scripted podcasts where we're just reading from a script now know that that's absolutely not the case. So we will, the second we finish recording, we will have a look. I think it's 5 flags. I think the Canadians are there. Because the reason I say that is because people always say, where are the New Zealanders? Why have we missed out our Anzac brothers? Yeah. But it would have, if we had to include the entire coalition that was fighting, there would be 115 flags. So we've got to.
I'm now going to reword it, and I'm just going to say there are a lot of flags flying at Hamel.
I'm actually looking it up as we speak. Carry on, Pete.
Okay, so so a great memorial, and certainly well worth going to have a look at. So we're going to walk back to where we parked the car. There is a little toilet block, as I said, which is bizarrely is crucial on the battlefield. And then beside the toilets, we have another little area of preserved trenches, which is always worthwhile having a quick rummage through that as well. I always like to get people onto the landscape if we can. But the views are just spectacular. It is extraordinary what we can actually see from here. Once this was taken, this effectively was the end of the battle. It's the final objective. It was taken within within that, I'm going to say it, that 90 odd minutes. It doesn't really matter. It was taken as it was planned to be taken, and we dig in, and then we wait again, and literally a month later, on the 8th of August, or just over a month later, then that black day for the German army, and this is where we're going to jump off. This is where it's going to the Australian troops will attack from.
I am looking at a photo of the memorial now, Pete, and left to right we have American, British, Australian, French, Canadian flags.
Of
flying.
course,
so I'm glad we cleared that up. And the Canadian flag is obviously there because of the essential role that not so much in this battle, of course, but the essential role that the Canadians played alongside the Australians on the 8th of August. I like the fact that this site is also a nod to the 8th of August. And as much as we say that, as Australians, we tend to be a bit one-eyed about the Battle of Hamel and claim that it was the turning point of the war, I love that at this site, it's also very much a commemoration of the 8th of August as well, the Battle of Amiens. And that was the day that changed everything in the war, the Black Day. And when you stand there and if you look east, you see a little wood way on the skyline, and you can just see the spire of a church peeking out above it. And as I said, that is the village of Proyard. It was not taken for a couple of days. It wasn't taken on the 8th of August, but that was close enough as it makes no difference. That was where the advance ended. And when you see how far, I mean, was it something 12 kilometres they advanced on the 8th of August? Just incredible from this point. Yeah. Just the Germans called it Der Schwarze Tag. Absolutely. The Germans called it Der Schwarze Tag, the Black Day. So again, I always like that this site commemorates the 8th of August as much as it commemorates the Battle of Hamel.
I'm just going to do the final figures. I think it's important that we have a look at the casualties. I would give them accurately to you if I possibly could, but I looked at 3 or 4 different sources and they all gave me different figures. So I've kind of had to come up with a mean average, really. So approximately 1,400 German prisoners were taken. And 2,000 Germans were killed during the fighting. Australian casualties, about 1,062, which is an odd figure. It seems like a very accurate figure, but then I found another account saying 1,400. So around about, let's say, 1,250 Australian casualties. And then this is where I've had such a real variety of figures. One quote, 800 killed. I think that's just wildly over the top. And then another quote, 250 killed. So I think I'm going to stick with the 250 killed. Have you seen figures for these, Matt, at all?
Yeah, it's always a bit confusing. I'm not sure why in a battle that was so well documented that there's so much confusion. We know for a fact that there's almost an unshakable rule in the First World War that when you look at the casualty figures that about 1/3 are killed and 2/3 are wounded. So that would put it. So I think you're right. I think it's probably 1,200 odd casualties and maybe about 400 killed. I would imagine would be a fair assessment. But I agree. It's strange that we can't seem to get any agreement. It could be the fact that it could be the division involved. There were so many divisions involved, and one brigade from each division. It could be something to do with that. But yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint. But I'd say if we thought about 1,200. Casualties with 400 killed. The one thing that you just can't overlook is how much lighter the casualties were for the attacking force than the defending force, which is very rare in the First World War. You normally, in the First World War, like in many wars, they looked at that 3-to-1 ratio that you want 3 times the number of troops attacking as defending, and the attacking troops are the ones that are going to suffer the huge casualties. Certainly wasn't the case here, so it reflects how well the battle was planned and carried out. We should, before we go, Pete, let's also talk a little bit. You mentioned the first Medal of Honor to an American. In the First World War. Thomas Pope. Talk to us a little bit about Thomas Pope.
Okay, Thomas Pope, again, advancing embedded. So these guys were not all put together. So the Americans are not in, I think there were several companies, 4 companies attacking, but they were not all together. They were spread liberally amongst the Australians. And so I'm going to read his citation. He's serving with Company E of the 131st Infantry, 33rd United States Infantry Division. His company
Doesn't that just sum up right there, Pete? Doesn't it just sum up the immense size of the US forces that are already being employed? This is already the 33rd Division. Not necessarily all there at once, but the Australians only had 5 divisions in total. He's part of the 33rd.
And this is just the start. I did have the figure of the number of Americans at this period that were arriving in Europe, and it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling how many Americans, and that's what the Germans knew. That's why the Germans at this period knew they were going to lose the war, because the Americans are here. It's not about their fighting ability. It's about their manpower. There's just so many of them. His company was advancing behind the tanks when it was halted by hostile machine gun fire. Going forward alone, he rushed the machine gun nest, killed several of the crew with his bayonet, and standing astride the gun, held off the others until reinforcements arrived and captured them. So it's you get this great imagery, don't you, straight away, of this American standing above this captured machine gun with his bayonet fixed, holding off any attempt by the Germans to recapture it until help arrived. So a very kind of heroic imagery, and one that the Americans would have loved. The first Medal of Honor going to a soldier fighting here, Corporal Thomas Pope.
Something I discovered, Pete, relatively recently when I was doing some historical research for Peter Fitzsimon's book on the Battle of Hamel. Something I discovered, I'm not saying I was the first one to find this, but it certainly hadn't been noted very widely to that point, is that Pope was the very next day, the 5th of July, was heading back to the reserve area, and a random shell landed and wounded him, and he was shipped home and never returned. So his war was one day. The 4th of July 1918 was effectively his one day of combat in the First World War, and he made good use of it by earning the Medal of Honor. We should certainly, Thomas Pope represents the Americans who, as you say, they were just inexperienced. It's no reflection on their fighting ability as individuals, it's just that they were inexperienced, and several Australians were killed trying to get the Americans sorted out during the attack at Hamel, as would also occur in later battles where the Australians fought alongside. There was one Australian sergeant. The Americans were in danger of walking too quickly and walking into the creeping barrage, the shells that were falling in front of them. And one Australian ran forward to try and hold them back, and he was killed by an Australian shell that landed and wounded him, and he later died of his wounds. So, yeah, an important moment. I mean, and even today, Hamel is brought up, politically when Australians, when we talk about the ANZUS Treaty and the way that Australia has always fought so well alongside the Americans. Occasionally, we do flip it back and say the first time that the Americans in the 20th century fought alongside their allies was with the Aussies at Hamel. So, this was really the start of a very important Australian-American association, which has continued to this day in various forms. So Hamel is often looked back on as that first time Australians and Americans fought together.
I have to say, this battle is used by almost all armies, modern armies, as an example of an all-arms attack. And quite often you'll find little groups of guys, very short hair, here at this site, and they are what are known as staff rides. In other words, what they are officers in training or officers promotion courses, and they come here because you can stand at this site, the site where we are now, the Australian Corps Memorial Park, and you can effectively stand here and talk the whole battle from this one point. We've just done the walk, but you could actually come here and you can talk the whole battle, and because it is such a classic action, the very first, what you would describe as the very first all-arms attack, tanks, guns, aircraft, infantry, all knowing what each other's doing and all supporting each other, that it is important, and so it's taught still to this day. People come here and are taught about this battle.
And the main reason that can be done, we should say, is it was a small battle. That's right. That, as you say, you can stand there at that one site and see the whole battlefield. The reason, that's not to take anything away, but it was a very compact, contained battle in a small space. You can see the entire battlefield. There's no way you can see the battlefield of the 8th of August or any of the later actions that occurred, but you can stand here on this hill, and like looking at a map, you can see the whole terrain and the importance of that terrain in the effectiveness of the all-arms battle. So yeah, a good spot. You'll often see army groups here talking about the battle. Just a great spot. Absolutely, if you're interested in Australian actions, whether you're Australian or one of our international listeners, definitely go to this site. It's a really wonderful spot, and pays tribute to a lot of very brave men on both sides. So always a great site to visit. Pete, once again, thank you so much, mate. I learn so much from doing these talks with you that I come into them thinking I know these battlefields, and I come out with my knowledge greatly expanded. So once again, mate, thank you just for your rare insights into these important chapters of history.
No, it's a pleasure, Matt. I always go away thinking, I didn't mention that, and I didn't talk about this, but it'll be, we can save it for another day.
Don't forget, when we're allowed to visit the battlefields again, Pete is one of our key guides on the battlefield. So there's a very good chance if you join us on one of our battlefield tours through Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours that Pete Smith will be your guide. You can even request him if you want to. If you are signing up for one of our group tours, you can request that Pete Smith is your guide, and you will get this and so much more on the ground with Pete Smith, which is an absolute treat, and perhaps get to share a cold beer at night as well. So, Pete, I'm looking forward to when we can get back and start showing people the battlefields for real. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us on these virtual walks.
Pleasure, Matt. Very enjoyable.
Balancing a wellness routine and busy travel plans? Try Allo Moves, the health and wellness app you need to stay consistent. Join allomoves.com with code ACAST for a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership. From yoga and Pilates to strength workouts, Allo Moves has it all. From 5 to 60 minutes, Allo Moves has classes or flow that fit your schedule. Plus, Allo Moves offers meditations, sound baths, nutrition tips, and self-care tutorials. Find your perfect wellness routine anytime and anywhere with Allo Moves.
At Leidos, a brilliant mind is smart, but a brilliant team is smarter. A ship that finds enemy subs is smart, but an autonomous fleet, that's smarter. Defending against cyber attacks? Smart. Stopping attacks before they start? Smarter. And using AI tools is smart. But integrating trusted mission AI into your technology is smarter. We're not just making technology solutions in national security and health. We're making smart smarter. Leidos.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our FlexPath learning format lets you learn on your own schedule. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.